Hello, my name is Michelle Hunt, and this is my case study for EDL 851. Just to summarize the case study, the principal of the school is completing evaluations on all of his new teachers. There's a teacher, Mrs. Stevens, who is having trouble getting her students engaged in her lessons and student behavior during multiple observations. He noticed this. Um, he states that when he enters the classroom, the students settle down and stop talking. He's made multiple suggestions to her post-conference in her post-conference meeting, and she was not accepting of those suggestions. She states that she has tried to motivate the students, but as soon as he comes in, that they clam up. She says there is no research that shows student growth depends on student involvement. And after a lot of thought, he decided not to renew her contract for the following year. She was upset about the low ratings and said that these were not a fair assessment of her teaching abilities, and she stated that she would take it to court if needed. A quick overview of the case study. The principal completed the um, eleva- elevation evaluations. Mrs. Stevens is having trouble with classroom engagement and behavior. He suggests ways to improve. The principal states that Mrs. Stevens is irritable and difficult to communicate during meetings. The principal also concludes to issue a non-renewal after this evaluation meeting. Mrs. Stevens is very defensive about the meeting and the ratings and says she will take it to court if needed. Legal or ethical issues. The principal did not give specific personal learning for Mrs. Stevens would be an ethical issue. Mrs. Stevens seemed unaware of the problems in the classroom until the post-observation meeting, and the principal had noticed these problems and had not said anything to her yet. Legal issues. I am not sure if there were any legal issues with the principal. Nothing that stood out. Now, with the non-renewal, we did not get a chance to look at the district's contract, and since I have worked with contracts a lot, I would definitely want to see that to make sure that he didn't violate or breach any of her contract. Um, I do know that with Eudora School District, a certified contract, um, the principal would need to also complete an evaluation for the following semester, and that those two evaluations would then take into consideration before a non-renewal. So just after one semester, they wouldn't be able to come up with a non-renewal. In my district, his actions would actually be a breach of contract. None of these actions seemed discriminatory or harassment of any type. The principal seemed not to understand how Mrs. Stevens did not grow as an educator. Mrs. Stevens would be harmed with the non-renewal of the contract. She was not given any specific ways to improve her teaching abilities. Okay, during the evaluations, the principal concluded that Mrs. Stevens had had a hard time with student engagement and behavior in the classroom. Without any specific professional learning recommendations, he recommended a non-renewal. A few facts that I saw missing. People were a teacher mentor, another evaluator to get a different rating to make sure that the ratings are adequate and equal. Teachers for Mrs. Stevens to observe would also be helpful. Places that may be missing: a classroom for Mrs. Stevens to observe, another interaction with Mrs. Stevens outside the classroom. The only time the principal interacted with her during this whole case study was in the classroom during some type of observation. Programs: a mentorship program, a personalized professional learning, as well as a professional learning contract, and there was no professional development plan. After reviewing the case study, I found that there was information that was missing that may have changed the outcome of the evaluation process for Mrs. Stevens. First, there was no interaction outside of the classroom between the principal and Mrs. Stevens. He had not built a relationship or built any professional capacity with her, other than being her boss. I feel that if he had built this relationship and worked on professional capacity outside of the classroom, She would have been more accepting of the suggestions he made. Secondly, there was never any mention of how long Mrs. Stevens had been teaching. It states that she has an excellent background in the subject matter. I'm sure if that specifically means she's a seasoned teacher, or is this her first year teaching. Without this information, I will assume that could have used a teacher mentor to help her implement some of these suggestions the principal had given her. I also think that Mrs. Stevens would have benefited from observing other teachers in the same subject area that she was teaching. She was also never given the opportunity for personalized learning and or a professional development plan to help better her teaching methods. Lastly, Mrs. Stevens should have had the opportunity to have another evaluator come in and evaluate to make sure that they had similar ratings. This would have helped to validate the ratings that the principal had given her. Who did all this involve? Mrs. Stevens and the principal. What? Mrs. Stevens was observed and given a below average or average ratings on her observation. Now, these were all subjective ratings. I didn't feel like any of them were non subjective. Where at a school, we don't have a specific name or given a level of students that she is teaching. Important information. Mrs. Stevens did have multiple observations. It sounded like both informal and formal. The principal concluded that Mrs. Stevens lacked control and rapport with her students. Mrs. Stevens had trouble engaging and motivating and making her lessons meaningful. She was resistant to the feedback from the principal, as well as she received a average rating from her observations. Post observation meeting, the principal let her know that he would come back for another observation. When he did return, he saw the same teaching methods used before and decided not to renew her contract. The action plan. Okay, there are 3 options I came up with that you could do. You could, 1, go through the non renewal process and face any legal issues if there was a breach of contract. Kansas is a right to work state, though, so if there was no breach of contract, the employee can be let go. Option 2 would be have another observer come in and observe Mrs. Stevens to get a more accurate rating and make sure that both ratings are similar. Option 3 would be to have another observer come in and observe Mrs. Stevens to get a more accurate rating, as well as then the ratings are the same, could assign Mrs. Stevens on a plan of improvement, which would include peer observations, a peer mentor, personalized learning, and observations by the principal later on in the school year, as well as another observer to see if there was any improvements. Okay, so the pros and cons would be Mrs. Stevens, if I to choose option 3 would be my choice. And if you did that, Mrs. Stevens keeps her job. The principal states that Mrs. Stevens is intelligent and has excellent experience in her subject matter, so that would be helpful for the students as well as other staff members. There would be growth of an educator as well as other educators in the building. You would avoid a lawsuit if there was any breach of a contract. Principal can start to build a relationship with Mrs. Stevens, as well as building more professional capacity with the whole building. The other teachers have an opportunity to show growth from the personal learning experiences that Mrs. Stevens is acquiring. Cons. There is a strained relationship between the principal and Mrs. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens could be resistant to the plan of improvement, and Mrs. Stevens may not show any growth even following the plan of improvement. So I would choose option 3, as I just stated, and that would consist of me finding another admin to conduct another observation to see if they get similar ratings. Now, this could be anyone from an instructional coach, another admin in the district, to the superintendent. If so, then I would put in place a plan of improvement. In the plan of improvement, I would have a peer mentor, classroom observations, personalized learning, as well as other observations throughout the school year. I do think there might be some hesitation, though, from Mrs. Stevens, since there was never a level of trust built with the principal, but I do think that this would be the best way to move forward. This would also resolve any breach of contract and have evidence that is not subjective, as well as other sources, other admin, to back up our claims if there was no improvement. Okay, so how I would implement this plan is I would call another meeting with Mrs. Stevens, let her know that I would be having an instructional coach or an admin come and do another observation. Meet with Mrs. Stevens and the instructional coach or other admin to go over the ratings from the observation. Now, if those were very similar ratings, if we both had the same ratings, I would put a plan of improvement in place over the course of the next school, over the course of the rest of the school year. I would assign her a mentor as well as schedule classroom observations for Mrs. Stevens to go and watch peers teach the same subject matter who are both engaging as well as have classroom behavior control. I would then work with the instructional coach to set up personalized learning for Mrs. Stevens. I also feel that this personalized learning, the other new teachers could probably benefit from as well as maybe other teachers who may want to join in. I would then schedule observations with Mrs. Stevens, both both informal and formal, with myself and the instructional coach. I would want to make sure that we're seeing growth over time. I would then hold a post meeting, um, or probably multiple meetings throughout this time to go over what we're seeing, how we're seeing progress, as well as the positives and negatives that we're seeing. And then at the end of the school year, I would give a recommendation as well as continue the plan for the following year with taking some parts away uh, or taking the observations, but having the growth and personalized learning available for her. Who needs to know? The instructional coach would need to know, as well as the superintendent, the teacher mentor, as well as Mrs. Stevens. I feel that I'd want to involve the other individuals to have more than just my opinion with other opinions and more data as well as input for Mrs. Stevens. It would be hard to counter the ratings. If the chosen option does not work, I would then recommend a non-renewal, knowing that I did everything that I could do to help Mrs. Stevens. If Mrs. Stevens didn't want to complete the chosen option, I would contact the superintendent and discuss with them what the next steps moving forward should be, as well as suggest a non renewal. Okay, correlation. The case study correlated with the standard, allowing me to take a real life situation and practice making the decisions that would affect the well being of staff and students in a school in a safe environment. I took these steps to build professional capacity in the school as a future leader, as well as professional growth for Mrs. Stevens as well as other staff. I found this assignment really relevant as a future leader because I was able to practice building my professional capacity, implement a system for evaluation, and promote the well being of my staff and students while I'm practicing in a safe learning environment. I always enjoy completing the case studies at the end of the class. I feel that they're more beneficial for me than actual all the article readings and summarization. I feel that I get to take that information that I learned in the articles and put it to work. I feel like these case studies are very helpful that we are in a safe learning environment and that I can practice my admin skills and get feedback from an experienced admin themselves.